The government has set debt targets as a key component of UK economic policy. I think that this approach to targets is just incompetent and bizarre. I know these are strong words, but I don't think I'm exaggerating. I did a video recently on the totally incompetent tax policy of the UK government and their obsessions with tax cuts as a way to grow the economy, despite evidence showing that tax cuts have no significant effect on economic growth. Yet the government is obsessed by tax cuts as a centrepiece of its economic policy. Again, incompetent is a strong word, but I think it's fully applicable. A recent statement from a Treasury spokesperson set out how the government would describe its economic policy around the fiscal rules and debt targets. It talked about credible fiscal rules. It talks about responsible action. It talks about being on track to meet these fiscal rules. It goes on that rules provide growth and stability. They reduce borrowing and debt so that the economy can withstand shocks. When you hear this, it sounds quite comforting. It sounds like the government's in control. It sounds good. But the fiscal rules are really strange. They're really bizarre. They don't make sense. They're like an accounting trick. It does seem to convince and satisfy the markets. But here's the bizarre thing. The fiscal rules don't actually reduce debt for at least 5 years. And the government's making tax cuts despite there being a crisis in public services. This is a disaster. It's incompetent. The latest fiscal rules are set out in this Treasury document. One of the key rules is that public sector debt as a percentage of GDP should be falling in 5 years. Let's just pause here. We're going to reduce debt in 5 years. Imagine I did that with my credit card. Imagine how much interest would build up even if the credit card company agreed to it. How inefficient and irresponsible this would be. It's a crazy policy. Looking at the actual forecasts for debt to GDP, it's forecast to increase from 88.8% in 2023-24 to 93.2% 4 years later in 27-28. Debt is increasing throughout this period. Yet this is what the government calls being on track. The fiscal rule will be met, but not for 5 years. In the 5th year, there will be a small reduction from 93.2% to 92.9% in 2028-29. At face value, this just seems ridiculous. The argument that's employed in favour of this approach is that the best way to reduce debt is through growth. The best way to get growth is through tax cuts, and so this is the policy. But it's not going to work. The evidence on tax cuts is that they have no significant effect on economic growth. Tax cuts are successful on one thing: making the rich richer, increasing inequality. Meanwhile, the implications for public services are devastating. I've done another video on the spending implications of this policy. Look at this. It emphasises how ridiculous this all is. The OBR produces these so-called fan charts. They provide a range of outcomes based on past errors. They're not really forecasts. They're all the possible outcomes that if past errors in forecasting were repeated. Yet the whole discussion around the budget was, does the government have enough headroom to give tax cuts? A real fine-tuning of the figures. And indeed, cuts in national insurance were announced in the budget. The truth is that this is based on a 5-year, very specific target. Anything could happen between now and then. It's such fine-tuning, as if the government has that level of control. It doesn't. We're in a period of global instability with wars, pandemics, supply-side shocks. The fan chart probably is a reasonable indicator of the outcomes. But it's nothing to do with government policy. For me, this is just incompetence, accounting fictions, numbers that add up today but are highly unlikely to add up in an uncertain future. Is the Labour Party offering anything different? You would think that Starmer and Reeves would be jumping on this to provide strong opposition, challenging this incompetence. I'm afraid the answer is no. In a recent lecture to the City, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, said, "Let me be clear about the rules that will bind the next Labour government. Debt must fall by the 5th year of the forecast." It's exactly the same as the Tories, but somehow Labour is going to do it better. It's ridiculous. This is really disappointing government opposition. I'm actually quite surprised that the approach hasn't been more challenged. It seems to have been accepted by most politicians, by the markets and by the press. There has started to be some questioning of the policy, getting a bit of traction in the press. A recent article in The Times had the headline, "Fiscal Targets Damaging the Economy." The article reported on the findings of 3 major economic think tanks. Fiscal rules are found to be constraining government from making good decisions. It's found to be causing growth-sapping cuts in public investment, and economic recovery is being hindered by these policies. There are alternatives. We could increase tax on the super wealthy. We could even increase borrowing. Fiscal responsibility is important, but it doesn't mean you can never borrow. It depends what you borrow for. The government could increase borrowing, yet as long as it's making good investments in future growth that will pay off the debt. Ironically, increasing borrowing to invest in growth of the economy is more likely to reduce debt in 5 years than the current cross your fingers and hope fiscal rules. We need a dramatic recovery plan. Increase taxes on the wealthy, reduce taxes on ordinary people, increased borrowing for major public projects like housing, health, transport, education. This will bring about growth. In the meantime, whether we have a Conservative or Labour government, the incompetence continues. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.